Project Golgotha, the fossilized city beneath the Appalachians.
Disclaimer: the content presented in this video is purely fictional and intended for entertainment purposes only.
I write this account not for publication, nor for the curiosity of some faceless committee. This is for you, whoever you are, tasked with sorting through the wreckage of Project Golgotha and determining what went wrong. You'll find my name scattered through the files, attached to reports and assessments, but this is the truth of what happened in Aeternum Fossilis. It is all I can offer before whatever is inside me takes hold completely. Even now, I'm not sure what compels me to write. Fear, perhaps. Guilt, most certainly. But there is something deeper, a kind of pull, like the city itself is still alive inside me, its influence working through my hands. If that sounds absurd, you'll come to understand. By the time you finish reading this, you'll believe me, or you'll wish you didn't. It began in the spring of 2015, though the roots of this nightmare go back far earlier. The city, our discovery, wasn't new. It had always been there, slumbering beneath the Appalachian Mountains, buried in rock that predates anything resembling humanity. A geological survey stumbled upon it, their equipment picking up irregular seismic patterns deep within the earth. The initial assumption was a massive cave system, but the scans revealed impossible structures, symmetry and design where there should have been none. The site was immediately classified. Too advanced, too alien, the report said. Though they didn't use the word alien officially. The Department of Defense called it Aeternum Fossilis, a name that sounded appropriately grand and harmless, and they established Project Golgotha to oversee its exploration. The name should have been a warning. They recruited me from Princeton, where I'd been publishing work on ancient civilizations. My specialty is piecing together the lives of dead cultures, reconstructing their stories from ruins and relics. I wasn't prepared for this. None of us were. The team was small by design, 6 of us, each chosen for our specific expertise. We were given enough information to prepare but not enough to grasp the scale of what we were walking into. I still remember the first briefing in the Pentagon's windowless conference room. The air was stale with recycled coolness, and the lights overhead buzzed faintly, just enough to crawl under your skin. A man from the Department of Defense, whose name I never caught, stood at the head of the table and projected a grainy, black and white image onto the wall. I scanned the room as I took my seat. Eliza Ward, a paleobiologist I recognized from a few conferences, nodded at me briefly before returning her attention to the table. Malcolm Reyes, a geologist with a reputation for being prickly but brilliant, was scribbling in a notebook. There was a military officer, Lieutenant Daniel Price, whose sharp posture and unreadable face gave him away instantly. The other 2, Tessa Burke and Victor Green, I didn't recognize, though their demeanor suggested they weren't academics. Once I sat, the man in gray pressed a button on a small remote, and the room's lights dimmed. A grainy, black and white image flickered onto the screen at the far end of the room. This, he began, is Aeternum Fossilis. We believe it to be a fossilized city. The structure you see here is nearly a mile underground. The image was hard to interpret at first, just a mass of jagged shapes and shadows. But as he spoke, the details began to emerge: walls, arches, and spire-like formations frozen in place. The structures were unmistakably artificial, yet their contours felt disturbingly organic. This site was discovered 6 months ago during a routine geological survey in the Appalachian Mountains, he continued. Initial analysis indicated the presence of an extensive underground cave system. However, further investigation revealed something far more significant. He clicked the remote again, and a series of diagrams replaced the photograph. This is a fossilized city. The structures you're seeing are petrified, composed of minerals that replaced their original organic material over time. Wait, Eliza interrupted, leaning forward. You're saying these structures were alive? We believe so, yes, the man said, his tone flat, clinical. Though the exact nature of their function remains unclear. What we do know is that the site is over 1 billion years old. The room fell silent. That's impossible, Malcolm muttered, shaking his head. A billion years ago, Earth wasn't even hosting multicellular life. And yet, the man replied, radiometric dating of the surrounding rock confirms the timeline. This predates not only human civilization but all known life forms capable of creation. Tessa, the data technician, finally broke the silence. What exactly do you want from us? We want answers, the man said. Your team has been assembled because each of you brings a unique expertise to this project. Dr. Falk, you'll lead the team in studying the cultural and structural aspects of the site. Dr. Ward, you'll analyze the biological components. Dr. Reyes, your focus will be on the geological and material properties. Lieutenant Price will oversee security and ensure operational efficiency. Ms. Burke and Mr. Green will handle technical and structural analysis. And the goal? I asked, to determine what this city is, who built it, and why. Eliza frowned. And what happens if we find something we don't understand? The man's lips twitched into what could have been a smile, or a warning. That's why we've chosen you, Dr. Ward. We trust you'll figure it out. 2 weeks later, we stood at the entrance to the site. The journey had been arduous, a helicopter ride over the Appalachian wilderness, followed by an hours-long trek through dense forest to a remote, guarded facility. The entrance itself was nothing more than a narrow shaft descending into the earth, lined with steel supports and dim, flickering lights. Welcome to Golgotha, Lieutenant Price said as we entered a metal-caged elevator. His tone was dry, almost amused. We descended into the earth like divers slipping into a deep and uncharted ocean, the dim light from above fading until only the faint hum of our equipment and the rhythmic clank of the elevator cage surrounded us. Lieutenant Price stood closest to the controls, his sharp silhouette barely illuminated by the flickering overhead bulb. He kept his hand on the lever as if the whole contraption might fail at any moment. Eliza, you good? I asked, noticing her pale face in the weak light. Yeah, fine, she said, but her voice was clipped. She gripped the railing with both hands, knuckles white. The elevator jolted to a stop, and the gates slid open with a screech. We stepped out onto a grated metal platform suspended above a gaping void. Floodlights, mounted at irregular intervals, illuminated the cavern below in stark white. The light cast long shadows that danced across the walls, making the space seem even more foreign, and there it was, Eternum Fossilis. The first thing that struck me was the scale. The city stretched beyond the range of the floodlights, its fossilized structures merging with the darkness. The buildings, if they could even be called that, rose like skeletal spires, their surfaces riddled with porous patterns that reminded me of coral or bone. Arches and bridges crisscrossed the space, their intricate designs defying architectural logic. It was both mesmerizing and deeply unsettling. It's beautiful, Eliza said softly, breaking the silence. The path from the platform to the city floor was a series of metal staircases and reinforced walkways that zigzagged their way downward. The further we descended, the more oppressive the air became, heavy and stale, carrying a faint, metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. The silence was almost suffocating, broken only by the crunch of boots on gravel and the occasional creak of the scaffolding. When we finally reached the city floor, it was like stepping onto another planet. The ground was covered in a thin layer of fine dust, disturbed only by the fossilized veins of what might once have been roadways. The buildings themselves loomed above us, their shadows stretching long and jagged across the terrain. Malcolm knelt, his tools already in hand. He scraped away a bit of dust, revealing a smooth, fossilized surface beneath. He muttered something under his breath as he worked, his movements methodical and precise. Victor Green let out a low whistle as he scanned the cavernous space with his flashlight. Jesus! The beam swept across the entrance to the city, revealing angular walls that rose into darkness. Massive fossilized structures towered ahead, their forms eerily symmetrical but undeniably organ-like. It was like stepping into the ribs of some long-dead colossus. Eliza, standing beside Victor, muttered under her breath, "This doesn't feel real." "It is," Malcolm Reyes said flatly, "calcium carbonate in silica deposits. Perfect mineral replacement. But the texture. He ran a gloved hand over the surface and frowned. I've seen cultivated corals that look less deliberate. Stay close, Price ordered. His voice cut through the quiet, authoritative but calm. Until we've cleared the immediate area, no wandering off. No one argued. The vastness of the cavern swallowed our small group. And the faint echoes of our movements seemed to mock the idea that we had control over this environment. I could feel the weight of the mountain pressing down on us, the knowledge that we were a mile beneath the surface settling heavily in my chest. Let's move, I said, taking the lead. We'll head for the main structures first. Document everything. The approach to the city was slow, deliberate. Our lights played over colossal, skeletal formations that seemed to grow from the ground. Each structure was riddled with a latticework of pores and branching patterns. The sheer scale was staggering, arches and spires reached heights that no human architecture could match. Eliza stopped abruptly, shining her flashlight on a nearby wall. Look at this, she said, kneeling down. I joined her, crouching beside what looked like a segment of fossilized bone. It was massive, the porous texture riddled with spirals and ridges. Petrified cartilage? I suggested, maybe, she said. But the patterns, they're too precise. It's like the whole thing was designed. Engineered. Malcolm joined us, squinting as he inspected the texture. If it was alive, it wasn't like anything on Earth. At least, not anything we've ever seen. I nodded, but the enormity of the implications felt too big to tackle just then. Let's keep moving. We moved deeper into Eternum Fossilis, the city swallowing us in its vastness. Each step forward felt more deliberate than the last, as if the ground itself were guiding us. I couldn't shake the sensation that we weren't supposed to be there, or maybe we were. It was hard to tell. That feeling of purpose, of intentionality, hung in the air like static. Victor Green, his flashlight beam darting between the skeletal spires, let out a low groan. Whoever, or whatever, built this didn't half-ass it. It's not human, Eliza said flatly. She was crouched beside what looked like a fragmented pillar, her gloved hand tracing the porous surface. Look at the patterns here. They're cellular. Almost vascular. This wasn't constructed, it was cultivated. Malcolm Reyes scoffed, the sound sharp and dismissive. He was already unpacking his equipment, muttering something under his breath about calcium carbonate deposits. Everything down here screams mineral replacement. You're looking at fossilization on a scale none of us have ever seen, sure, but don't romanticize it, Ward. This is rock, not tissue. And how do you explain the organization? She snapped, standing and gesturing at the spires surrounding us. Coral doesn't grow in straight lines. It doesn't form arches. Enough, I said, cutting through their argument. Catalog first. Speculate later. The last thing we need is to start chasing theories before we have data. Tessa Burke was already several paces ahead, her eyes darting between the glowing screen of her tablet and the towering edifices. She looked back at us, her voice measured but tight. I'm picking up faint magnetic fields. They're weak, but they're there. That's normal, Malcolm said dismissively. Fossilized material can retain residual magnetism. Tessa hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. This doesn't feel residual. It's patterned. Like it's pulsing. I glanced at Lieutenant Price, who stood off to the side, his hand resting on the butt of his sidearm. He hadn't said much since we'd arrived, but his presence was steadying, even if he looked as uneasy as the rest of us. What do you think? I asked. Price shrugged. I think we follow the orders. Document. Analyze. Keep our guard up. We continued onward, the city's immensity fully engulfing us. Tessa's tablet began to chime softly as she continued to record environmental data. These readings are strange, she said, frowning at the screen. temperature fluctuations, minor magnetic disturbances. It's like the city is reacting to us. It's dead, Malcolm said without looking up, his tone firm. Anything you're picking up is residual, like a phantom echo. There's nothing living here. Eliza tilted her head, her brow furrowed. Maybe not alive, but what if it's not entirely dead either? What if this fossilization is a kind of hibernation? Malcolm laughed under his breath. You're reaching. And you're blind, she shot back. Enough, I interjected again, my patience thinning. Over here, Victor called, his voice low and urgent. He was standing at the edge of what looked like an open courtyard, his flashlight trained on a shape jutting out of the ground. At first, I thought it was just another piece of fossilized architecture, a twisted column or collapsed archway, but as I got closer, the shape resolved into something horrifyingly familiar. It was a skeletal figure, humanoid but grotesquely elongated. Its ribcage flared out like the petals of a diseased flower, and its limbs were unnaturally bent. The joints bulging with what looked like calcified growths. Jesus Christ, Eliza whispered, kneeling beside it. Her hand hovered just above the fossilized remains, trembling slightly. It's bipedal. Look at the pelvis, the spine. This thing stood upright. But it's not human, I said. The words felt heavy as they left my mouth. It can't be. No, she agreed, her voice barely audible. But it's close. Malcolm joined us, his skepticism visibly wavering as he crouched to examine the figure. The proportions are wrong. The skull, look at the cranial capacity. It's massive. This thing would have to have been upwards of 10 feet tall. He adjusted his headlamp and leaned closer, inspecting the porous texture of the bones. This is incredible. The preservation. It's like the fossilization process froze everything pre-decomposition. I've never seen anything like it. Eliza reached out with a gloved hand, brushing away the thin layer of dust that covered the remains. Look at these bones. They're porous, like bird bones, but the structure. It's almost like cartilage. And this, Eliza said, pointing to the fossil's ribcage, these ridges. They're not just decorative. They're functional. Maybe for respiration. Circulation. It's fossilized, Malcolm said, there's no way to know for sure. This doesn't add up, Tessa said, staring at the readings on her tablet. The magnetic fields are stronger here. It's like they're concentrated around these remains. Maybe they were using the fields for something, Victor suggested. Power. Communication. We're way out of our depth here. Tessa's voice broke the silence, calm but strained. I'm detecting more of them. Straight ahead. We followed her lead, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The courtyard opened into a vast chamber, its floor scattered with similar skeletal figures. Dozens of them. They were sprawled in unnatural poses, as if frozen mid-motion. Some looked as though they were trying to shield themselves, their elongated arms twisted in front of their faces. Others were collapsed on their sides, their contorted spines suggesting some sort of agony. What the hell happened here? Price murmured, I don't know, I said. But this wasn't natural. Eliza was already moving among the remains, cataloging them with a feverish intensity. This wasn't just fossilization. These beings, whatever they were, they died suddenly. Look at the fractures, the way the structures collapsed in on themselves. It's almost like they were petrified. Petrified? Malcolm echoed, his voice sharp. You're suggesting what? That they turned to stone instantly? Look around, she said, gesturing at the chamber. Do you see any signs of decomposition? Erosion? These remains are pristine. Something happened here, something catastrophic. Tessa was pacing the perimeter of the chamber, her tablet held close to her chest. The magnetic fields are stronger here, she said. definitely localized around the remains. Price stepped closer to one of the figures, his flashlight casting long, edged shadows on the walls. If this was some kind of attack, who, or what, was responsible? Maybe it wasn't an attack, I said, the words leaving my mouth before I'd fully thought them through. Maybe this was deliberate. Eliza looked up from where she was crouched, her expression unreadable. You're saying they did this to themselves? I didn't respond. The idea was absurd. But as I stood there, surrounded by those grotesque, frozen figures, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was right. This wasn't a massacre. It was something else. Something intentional. I didn't know why that thought had entered into my mind. Victor broke the silence, his voice tight. We need to keep moving. If we're going to figure this out, we need more data. He was right, but I couldn't stop staring at the remains. The longer I looked, the more certain I became that we were standing in the aftermath of something we weren't meant to understand. We pressed on, leaving the chamber of bones behind. But the unease lingered, settling over us like a smog. Eventually we entered into what I can only describe as a thoroughfare, a long, straight corridor flanked by spire-like structures that reached upward, their tops vanishing into the darkness above. The porous walls were interspersed with oval-shaped openings, like windows in an insectoid hive. The ground beneath us was smoother there, with faint ridges that ran parallel to each other, like the grooves of a massive, petrified artery. This place feels too. Victor paused, searching for the right word. Organized. You know. Like it's not just a city. It's meant for something. Meant for what? I asked, more to myself than anyone else. Eliza knelt beside one of the ridges, running a gloved hand along its surface. These grooves, they remind me of vascular pathways. Like capillaries or veins. Veins don't fossilize into perfect geometry, Malcolm said, though his usual arrogance was tempered. Neither do buildings, Eliza countered. Tessa's voice broke the silence, tight and subdued. I'm picking up another fluctuation, stronger this time. Malcolm glanced over her shoulder at the tablet in her hands. Magnetic fields again? He asked, though there was a hesitation in his tone now. She nodded. Same signature as before, but it's getting more focused. Like it's drawing us toward something. Or we're walking into it, Victor muttered, his voice low. I glanced back at Price, who brought up the rear. His hand hadn't left the butt of his sidearm since we'd entered the city. His face was unreadable in the dim light, but the tension in his posture was clear. Narrowing. Wait. It's not just the fields. The temperature's rising. Malcolm checked his own instruments, his brow furrowing. That's impossible. We're over a mile underground. It's faint, Tessa said, but it's consistent. Whatever this is, it's active. Eliza stood, holding the sealed container carefully. Then we need to, a low rumble interrupted her, reverberating through the chamber like distant thunder. The columns seemed to shudder, the spirals on its surface catching the light in a way that made them look almost fluid. Tell me that was a coincidence, Victor said, his voice tight. No one answered. We spent hours in that chamber, cataloging and documenting, but the more we examined the platform and its radiating lattice of filaments, the more questions it raised. This structure, Victor said, still focused on the intricate weaving of filaments, it's almost fractal. Every piece I examine leads to smaller, more detailed layers. It's like it was designed to self-organize. Self-organize into what? Price asked, his voice edged with tension. He wasn't a scientist, but he was no fool. He could sense the unease growing in all of us. Victor shrugged. I don't know. A network? A machine? Something biological? All of the above. I don't think our categories apply here. Tessa was sitting on the edge of the platform, her tablet glowing faintly in the dim light. She was silent, scrolling through her readings, her brow furrowed. I glanced at the others. Eliza was crouched by one of the larger filaments, carefully brushing away dust and debris. Malcolm was examining a cross-section of the fossilized material, his expression unreadable. "Malcolm," I said, "what's your take?" He looked up, clearly annoyed at being interrupted. "On what? The fact that we're standing on a billion-year-old anomaly? Or the fact that every single reading we're getting defies logic?" "Both," I said flatly. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, the mineral composition here is consistent with fossilization, but the patterns," he stopped, searching for the right words. "They're too precise. This wasn't just a city. It was a system. Everything was interconnected. And now, it's like the whole thing is waiting for a signal." "A signal for what?" Price asked, stepping closer. "Reactivation," Eliza said softly, standing up and dusting off her gloves. The word hung in the air like a warning. None of us wanted to acknowledge it, but we all felt it, that creeping certainty that this place wasn't as dead as we wanted it to be. We decided to push further into the city, following the stronger magnetic pulses Tessa had detected. The path led us through more corridors and chambers, each one more elaborate than the last. The architecture became increasingly intricate, with overlapping arches and spiraling columns that seemed to defy gravity. "This is insane," Victor muttered as we walked. "Who builds like this? And how? There's no scaffolding, no framework. It's like the entire city was birthed." "Maybe it was," Eliza said, her voice tinged with awe. "Look at the consistency, the way the structures flow into one another. This wasn't constructed in the way we understand. It was grown." Eventually, we reached another large chamber, this one even more imposing than the last. It was circular, with a domed ceiling that stretched impossibly high. The walls were lined with rib-like structures that curved inward, giving the space a claustrophobic, almost womb-like feel. At the center of the chamber was a massive, fossilized structure, encased in what looked like crystalline material. It was shaped like an organ, living, yet mechanical. "What the hell is that?" Victor asked, stepping closer. "The heart of the city," Eliza whispered. We all gathered around the structure, staring at it in silence. It was massive, at least 10 feet tall, with branching filaments that spread outward like veins. The crystalline casing caught the light from our flashlights, refracting it into faint, eerie patterns on the walls. Tessa was the first to break the silence. "I'm picking up stronger vibrations here. Much stronger. It's like it's resonating." "Resonating with what?" I asked. "Us, maybe." She said uncertainly. Victor reached out, his gloved hand hovering just above the crystalline surface. "This casing. It's not just a shell. It's part of the mechanism. You can see how the filaments feed into it." "Don't touch it," Price warned, his voice sharp. Victor pulled his hand back, but his curiosity was palpable. Eliza crouched by one of the branching filaments, examining it closely. "These structures, they're too complex to be decorative. They served a purpose." "What kind of purpose?" I asked. She shook her head. "I don't know. Power distribution, maybe. Or communication. This whole city, it's like a neural network. Every piece is connected, and this," she gestured at the organ-like structure, "this is the core." As she spoke, Tessa's tablet began to emit a soft chime. She frowned, tapping the screen. "What is it?" I asked. "These vibrations," she said. "They're changing. Getting more organized." "Organized how?" Malcolm asked, stepping closer. "Like a pattern," she said, her voice tense. "It's almost like..." She trailed off, her eyes widening. "Like what?" I pressed. "Like it's trying to communicate," she said finally. The words sent a chill down my spine. "Communicate with who?" Price asked, his grip tightening on his sidearm. "Us," Eliza said. Before anyone could respond, the chamber was filled with a low, resonating hum. It wasn't loud, but it was deep, vibrating through the floor and into our bones. What the hell is that? Victor asked, his voice rising. The hum deepened, reverberating through the chamber and into our bones. It wasn't sound, it was something deeper, a sensation that wormed its way into the spaces between thought and instinct. The crystalline structure at the center of the room pulsed faintly, the light spreading through the branching filaments like a slow-moving current. The vibrations, Tessa said, staring at her tablet, they're synchronizing. Look at this. She turned the screen toward us, showing a series of rising waveforms. It's generating a pattern. A pattern of what? Price snapped, his hand tightening on his sidearm. I don't know. Tessa shouted. Her voice on edge. This isn't like anything I've ever seen. Tessa was furiously tapping at her tablet, the glow of the screen reflecting off her wide, pale face. The magnetic fields are spiking off the charts. This isn't residual, this is active. Turn it off, Price barked. How? She shot back, her voice rising. We don't even know what it is. The hum surged, cutting her off mid-sentence. The light from the crystalline casing grew brighter, refracting into an intricate lattice that danced across the chamber walls. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw shapes in the patterns, figures moving in impossible, twisting gestures. I blinked, and they were gone. Eliza. I shouted over the noise. What are we dealing with here? She didn't respond. She was crouched by one of the filaments, her face illuminated by the pulsating light. Her lips moved silently, as though she were whispering to herself, Eliza. I barked again, louder this time. She looked up, her eyes glassy. It's communicating, she said, her voice distant, reverent. It's showing us something. Showing us what? I demanded. Before she could answer, the hum shifted. It wasn't louder, but deeper, more resonant, vibrating through my chest. The light from the crystalline casing intensified, casting the chamber into stark, almost blinding brightness. I staggered, my head swimming as the room seemed to blur and twist around me. And then the visions began. At first, it was just flashes, images that didn't belong in the darkness of the chamber. I saw towering landscapes of jagged peaks and glowing rivers, their colors muted and alien. The sky above them churned, black and red and something else entirely. Then the images became more coherent. For a brief, horrifying moment, I was somewhere else, a vast, alien landscape stretching endlessly beneath a sky fractured by jagged lines of light. Towering structures rose from the ground, their forms impossible, their surfaces rippling like living flesh. The figures were there too, moving among the structures, their bodies twisting in synchronized gestures that felt ritualistic. Purposeful, do you see it? Eliza's voice cut through the vision, sharp and urgent. I see it, I said, my voice trembling. It's not real, Malcolm muttered, though his tone lacked conviction. He was staring at the same vision, his lips moving soundlessly as if he were trying to decipher something. The figures in the vision shifted, their forms bending and twisting in ways that made my stomach churn. Their limbs elongated unnaturally, their torsos folding inward and then expanding outward in a grotesque display of fluidity. They were communicating, not with words, but with their bodies, their contortions conveying something I couldn't comprehend. What are they doing? Victor asked. His voice barely a whisper. Speaking, Eliza said. She took a step forward, her eyes locked on the glowing casing. I think I understand them. Understand what? Price demanded. What are you talking about? Eliza didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on the figures in the vision, her expression one of awe and terror. They're trying to show us something. The vision shifted again, the alien landscape dissolving into incomprehensible patterns, geometric shapes that folded and unfolded upon themselves, defying the laws of space and time. I felt a sharp pain behind my eyes, and I staggered, clutching my head. Malcolm let out a low groan, drawing our attention. He was hunched over, his hands gripping his temples. Do you hear that? He muttered, his voice strained. Hear what? I asked. The The words, he said, his voice trembling. It's like whispers, but not. I can't make sense of it. Malcolm, you're not making sense, Price said, stepping toward him. What words? They're not words. Malcolm snapped, his voice rising. It's something else. Something different. Malcolm, I said, stepping toward him. What are you? And then my vision began to distort. The walls of the chamber rippled, the fossilized filaments seeming to pulse in time with the vibrations. Patterns appeared on the surfaces, spirals, lattices, shapes that felt as though they were alive. No, I muttered, squeezing my eyes shut. It's not real. It's not real. When I opened them, the patterns were still there, shifting and flowing like liquid. Adrian, Eliza said, her voice pulling me back. She was standing by the crystalline casing again, her hand hovering just above it. This isn't just a machine. It's a memory. A record of what this place was. And what was it? Price asked, his tone edged with frustration. A network, she said. A system. Everything here, this city, it's all connected. It's all alive. It's hibernating, Malcolm said suddenly, his voice clear and steady. She's right. It's waiting to wake up.